Hey, welcome to another episode of the Rooted In podcast. We got the full crew here today. I don't want to say hi.
Hello.
And today we thought we would do kind of an overview discussion about the concept of deep learning. So we're going to kind of cover the whole concept from a more general perspective so that as we move through this season, we can hit on some of the specifics that fall under that umbrella and dive a lot more in depth. Deep learning.
Yeah. To dive deep into deep learning.
Very good.
And application of deep learning.
Right.
So those of you who've been with Rooted in Language know that we, have really strong feelings about some of the ways we teach, the strategies we use, what we would deem, more of a productive or less productive level, productive or less productive activity. And that's based on this sense of our goal is to not waste a lot of time that kids, that cognitive juice I always talk about that the struggling reader and writer doesn't have. Like, we don't want to really be using up a lot of cognitive juice on activities that aren't going to really give us a big bang for our buck.
Right.
We want to spend time doing some activities that we call, that foster deep learning. So I've talked about bits of this here and there, and certainly in last year's podcast, we had two podcasts that you might want to go back and listen to. I had one on skill, will, and thrill that I did with Julie Bogart from Brave Writer. And I had another one just kind of on this overview about deep learning and some thoughts on conversational instruction that I had with my sister, Jody Weber. So this year we're going to really focus on what we are doing with reading and writing. And when we talk about deep learning, one of the things that we want to be thinking about, there's some research by John Hattie, and we are going to dig into that more in future podcasts, some of his research about deep learning. But we use this phrase all the time, that reading and writing is a process, not a program. That in order to become good at such a complex skill, that it takes time, and you need to do that over time. It's going to involve some moments of failure, and what we want is that failure gets turned around, and mostly that there's enough success there that kids don't feel like they're drowning. So you've heard us say that before. Another thing about deep learning is that in order for learning to hit that greater depth that we want, it has to feel real and relevant to the student. And in fact, there's research to suggest that we make better synaptic connections in our brain if we can get to this real and relevant. And we all know that if we're listening to something new, like this podcast right here, if it's connected to something you already know, and you have a place to build that concept.
Or something you have identified that you really want to know about.
Right.
That can make it relevant.
That can make it very relevant. It could be that, this year this is my goal. That makes it relevant. It could be that you're doing it with someone that you really care about and you're enjoying that time with them, and that makes it more relevant.
Discussing goals with kids too at the beginning of a year can help make things really relevant. If you involve them in the process of setting up their own goals, then that puts some ownership a little bit more on them, and you can remind them, remember, this was a goal you actually had for yourself. This is not just me telling you to do it, which can feel removed, like I don't care about this.
And that plays into something we talked about in one of our Facebook lives called Metacognition. To foster deep learning, there does have to be some level of challenge. Again, we don't want to set up a situation where this is so easy that it actually makes me feel like, well, I'm not really feeling great about this. Anybody could do this. This is too easy for me. We really want to have this sense that, hey, this was a little more, and that's so much more meaningful to me. I just had a situation like that with exercise where I had been doing some good stuff, and then I hurt myself, and then I went back for my next session, and we had to reduce everything way down. And the whole time I was just battling this. The whole time he would say, good job, I would think, not really. This doesn't feel good. This feels like nothing, right? But then today I go in and I ramped it up that little bit more, and it still wasn't what I had want to do, but it was ramped up just enough that now I felt like I'd really done something.
A little
today.
more, a little better.
Yes, a little more, a little
It's
better.
our quote of the day.
It's our quote of the day, and it comes from,
That one's just a Kevinism.
yes,
Your trainer.
Right,
Yeah,
right. And
Kevin Furray.
yeah, Kevin Furray, and he always says that a little more, a little better, and that's what helps deep learning, is that little bit
So you're having like deep exercise learning, really.
yeah, I mean, deep
Deep physical improvement.
yeah, and you have to explore ideas. So I'm exploring, all the places I can have pain. But it does involve some problem solving, exploring ideas, and then also, and we are going to talk about each of these things in more depth
Right.
for deep learning for you as this series goes along. But the last one is we have to be interactive with it. We have to create a product. And Claire, you might want to reference the first podcast.
The podcast that went up that we were talking about art. We talk about this concept of creating a product, and we said there, and I guess I'll say again, that like the word product can sometimes feel like, oh, it has to be this big deal thing,
Or like a
capital
project
P, yeah,
almost.
project.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is sometimes true. That is a perfectly legitimate way of doing things. But that's not always the case, where, a project, or not a project, I be saying it, a product could be the fact that I just wrote something down, and there's a product. It could be that I drew something.
It could be you created a brainstorming list.
Right, yeah, just a list of something, a grocery list
Yeah,
is a product.
it is the child producing something during the learning activity, which involves and engages them in a way that is going to help them, comprehend better. It's going to stick in their brain better. It's going to be a deeper learning.
Right. It involves output.
Yes.
Don't you think?
Can be another way to say it.
Yeah, if you think of it that way. In fact, on Facebook, I had put up a study about conversational turn taking. So there had been studies in the past about kids, if they hear so many words a day, how that builds their vocabulary and all that. And what they realize is it's not the number of words. It's actually allowing the child to be engaged.
Yes.
So they take turns. If all I'm doing is listening, those of you who've sat in lectures know this, right? If all I'm doing is listening, then there's this level of passivity.
Right.
If I pick up a pen and start taking notes,
Yeah,
now
it's
that
more
level-
active.
yes,
Yeah.
so much more.
It's
But
Yeah,
if,
it is
if
a-
you're being asked questions during that and have to respond,
I was going to
Yeah,
say,
it's more
and
of a
yes or
if
no.
you have to then teach someone else
Right.
about
Well, yeah,
something, then
right.
that's like
So you
the
keep
highest
ramping
level,
it up
right?
here, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that like the note taking thing is a kind of a conversation in a form where if you're listening to something and responding, but you're responding kind of to yourself, I guess. But it is still that kind of turn taking idea.
Right.
Right.
It's still that
And,
conversation.
and you're formulating. You're not, you know the difference when you're just trying to get everything they said down and you think, I got that down, I'll have to read it later to see what I wrote.
Right.
Because you were so busy just, copy. You couldn't process and you couldn't formulate any ideas. But if you take what's said and you rewrite it for a note in your own words or in some shortened version that you've determined this is the phrase I need to
This
put
is the
down.
important
This is the
thing.
important part,
Yeah,
yeah.
right.
Now there's output, right?
Right.
So,
Right.
The formulation is a big concept, the big part of deep learning is that it's not just this kind of regurgitating and or passive listening. It is that involving your own cognitive skills in creating something that is semi-new, right? That is like of you. And therefore, that's why we often say, involving writing is that like one extra deep step as opposed to just talking about something.
Right, but the regurgitation thing can be kind of dangerous, or like because it can look very similar to like,
It
well, if I
can.
ask you a question and then you responded to me, well, it looks like you know what I'm talking about. It looks like you might be formulating your own ideas. So it can often, I guess, kind of hide
It
behind
can.
that.
A student just
Right.
repeating something back, and then you wonder why the next day they have no idea
Yeah, they
that
haven't
you even
right.
talked
held
about
it.
that.
Right.
Right. Yeah. If you're interested in reading more about that study, it was an MIT study done by John Gabrielli, and we did post an article on our Facebook page, but you could also look more into that yourself.
So that creates an interesting segue. Claire, you were talking about, if you're mimicking it, is it the same? So you might be thinking to yourself, well, then why, in rooted language, are we so into copywork and dictation?
Right,
It
which
feels
just like
mimicry,
regurgitation,
right?
copying.
But that is because of another principle. In order to foster deep learning, you have to come from a place where you have a solid foundation.
Right.
So
it's kind of backing up in the
and,
process.
and I do have another quote for us here.
Okay.
Tracy's our quote lady.
Today I seem to be full of quotes. This is a quote from Greg Cook, who's another fitness guru type, and he says, "You can't stack fitness on top of dysfunction." So interesting to take that from the fitness world into the educational deep learning.
Rooted in
environment.
fitness.
Yeah.
It's so interesting how fitness seems to have so many parallels to reading and writing and just learning in general, because it is this hopefully productive struggle forward, and there's a lot of feeling like you've lost things, and there's a lot of, if you stop doing something, you completely lose skills. There's a lot of parallels here that are
a ton of skills you're stacking in order to be able to do the next thing.
You can't do the next thing until you've mastered this little bit. And sometimes you work on something that feels trivial for a really long time, and then you realize much later how much of an impact that had. So there's just a lot of parallels here, and people tend to really identify with that because everyone's had an experience with some sort of physical activity that was a struggle.
And output matters.
Oh, totally.
I mean, apparently, I can't just watch like Ninja Warriors on TV.
Practice matters.
Apparently, I have to actually
wait. So if I just sit and watch like people curling and bench pressing, I get strong, right?
Absolutely.
And
if only.
Wanting to lose weight is the same as losing weight, right?
Right. All those things are true. So it's true in the learning world, and it's not enough for me to say, well, here's where I'm really, really comfortable. I don't have to do anymore, and I don't have to like push my muscles at all. I'll just do the same thing for years and years and years and years, and that makes me feel happy, but actually the outcome isn't what I want.
Right.
So it's that same idea. So anyway, back to starting with a strong foundation. That is why the copywork and dictation is important to us. If writing is one of our great outputs for deep learning, to foster deep learning, then we need to make sure we have the foundational skills
You have some
place.
skills there.
Right. So learning to write matters. There is research that shows that kids with poor handwriting tend not to write as much.
Right.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you don't like to do things you're not good at.
Right.
Yes.
It's hard to do something hard.
It's reflecting.
It is hard to do something hard, much like fitness.
And, sometimes you hurt yourself if you do too much. Okay.
One of the things we often talk about with that strong foundation, though, is that the more you can get some of these skills in an area of your brain that has become automatic, right? We call that automaticity. You can sort of shrink the cognitive juice that it takes for you to do something down to a tiny little box after a lot of practice. Then you can take on the next big thing and not have to be thinking about some of those smaller aspects. So that is that is behind that concept of strong foundation.
I like to compare that to driving.
Yeah.
There's so many skills when you drive that we've forgotten about because they've become automatic.
That is a
We
good
don't
comparison.
think about them. But then you go to teach your child to drive. Oh my gosh, you realize
how many things you're doing.
All these tiny little skills that you just don't even think about every day.
And I remember when I first learned to drive feeling like it took so much of my attention to stay between the lanes.
It was exhausting.
Yeah. And now that's not something I think about at all, and I can be more of a defensive driver if someone's coming at me in an area they shouldn't be. Whereas if I was a new driver trying to focus on staying between the lanes, I wouldn't notice someone coming at me.
Your cognitive juice is used up.
It's used up. Exactly.
Which I guess to kind of pull that back to the quote that you said about you're not being able, or you can't can't stack, I have no words, fitness on top of dysfunction, kind of pulling back to if you can't stay in between the lanes, if you can't formulate a letter properly,
or write a sentence.
Whatever the area of weakness might be, how do you then expect to put something on top of that? And if you then stack things on top of that without paying attention to that underlying, those bricks underneath,
that foundation.
the foundation, then it will crumble.
Right.
And you get to why we say don't just do copy work. We
Right.
want you to do intentional copy work,
Right.
intentional dictation, intentional editing.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't just say to a child who's struggling, here, just copy this.
Right.
Because what they're practicing are skills
Probably poor
that
skills.
are dysfunction,
Yes.
right?
Right.
And in the end, that doesn't get you anywhere.
Nope.
So
Right,
we talk about that and teach about that in our Roots Entwined class. I'll have a little statistic for you here because Maura mentioned automaticity. Stephen Graham, who's a professor of special ed at Vanderbilt, looked at this idea of writing speed. So speed is an automatic skill, right? This is something we work toward. We want to get to a certain level of speed so that when I'm sitting in a classroom taking notes or when I have to write this paper, I'm fast.
Right.
So he found that automaticity and speed is still an issue in 4th and 6th grade students. That speed increases till at least 9th grade. So a lot of times we have these questions like, how long should we be doing copy work and dictation? Well, think about that.
Wait, just to clarify.
At least 9th grade.
So speed, you're working on increasing speed up through 9th grade.
Yeah.
Well,
And
at
that's
least.
that's
At
kids
least.
Okay,
without
okay.
a struggle.
Yes,
This is
and that
just
is
an
average.
overview. This wasn't
Yeah.
looking at struggling. It was looking at all writers. And what he found is that increase in speed is still happening. There's automaticity still happening where these processes, it's all these different processes that need to work simultaneously or in perfect sequential order and quickly.
So that you're still working for automaticity. You
Right.
mean.
Well,
so it's like
yes.
things are still not
Well,
quite
and
automatic, but they're
Exactly.
working into that automatic bucket.
So you might say, well, my 4th grader really has no problem with copy work and dictation. Why should I still do it? Well, just think of speed right there. If they're fast now, think how much faster they're going to be. Yes.
How long that speedy process, that speeding up process takes is a reflection of how high a level activity writing actually is. And there are so many subskills involved.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that's easy to think, you know, if you have a child who's typical that, you know, well, they've kind of learned writing, they've learned it, right? But it's one of those things that continues to grow. It is so complex, continuing to work on those foundational automatic skills and building on those skills all the way through high school, even into college. Those skills are always expanding and growing because it is such a vast vast sea. There's so much there. So it's easy to get in this mindset of like, well, I think my child's fine, but even for a student who is typical, who is average, there is so much complexity there that they need to be continuing to practice and tap into to stay a strong language user.
Yeah, it's kind of an exponential process that like within writing, each skill can continue to grow, and in writing in general, you can continue to add new skills. So both it's growing what you already have and you continue to stack stuff on it. So
Which
it's
is
really
that building
exponential.
on what you already have.
Yeah.
And you know, that's one of the reasons why we like our LA Binder class, because remember we talk about that how to foster deep learning. You're building on what you already know. We're trying to have kids reach back. Yes, you learned this before. You've practiced this before.
Yeah.
All this, as we accumulate new information, it's easy to kind of start dropping some of what you learned. We all do it.
Which it serves both the ownership, right? Always building that ownership idea. It serves that purpose, but it also serves let's actually remind you what you know.
Yes.
Right,
And,
right.
you know,
It's that recycling back through constantly.
Right. I was thinking just today, I was reading about this. I was actually reading about the sequential process that takes place in your brain when you see a word. It was very, very interesting. All these different brain processes and the order in which they come into play. So it's super
there's a
interesting.
great new series that just started on PBS about the body, and they spend some time talking about the mind during this. I just watched the first episode last night, but they were talking about something like 1 trillion things firing in your brain
Yikes.
when you go to remember a new thing.
Yeah.
I mean,
like
it's
something
just
you just
incredible.
The brain
Yeah.
is an amazing machine.
Well,
There's so much going on.
I was thinking that the thing we need to remind ourselves is that there's no simple answer to a complex process.
Yeah. Isn't that
Right?
true?
That's
so
like
it's
a-
like, what?
Mind blown.
Yeah, right. this is
About
a
a
reading.
trillion things firing in my brain.
Yeah.
There you go.
Reading is a complex process.
Right.
Writing is possibly an even more complex process.
And humans are complex beings, and so there's never going to be the same necessarily path you take with one child to another.
Right.
So that while many processes can be considered best practice, we also know that every learner is different. So we have complex humans learning complex processes. This is part of what makes this so complicated.
In a complex way.
In a complex way.
Huh.
Right.
Well, and the reason we call ourselves Rooted in Language is a total acknowledgement of that complexity.
Yeah.
That this is not, hey, we tackle reading only through phonics, or hey,
Right,
we
right,
tackle
right.
writing only by handwriting practice, right?
Yeah.
This is, there are all these skills. They need strengthened.
Our brains use them all. Should be pulling on all of them for strong
Yes,
use.
and they need to be practiced, alone to build up that strength, and they need to be
Together.
practiced
Together.
together. And we say that all the time. And then, on top of it all, we have to use that process, reading and writing, for new learning,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
deeper learning.
Use your skills to access new information.
Yes,
Yes.
output,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
All of that is demanding something of those skills even more and more and more. This leads us back to questions we often hear. Is it okay if my child just listens to audiobooks? Is it okay if my child just dictates to me? There are times and places for those skills
Mhm.
and for those tools.
And for maybe giving your child a break and doing some of that, right?
Exactly.
There are times.
And you may be tapping into some of their higher skills that their struggle keeps hidden, right?
Mhm.
But that's never the end.
And we don't
Right.
want
I
to
feel
stay
like
there.
just that phrase of, is it okay if my child just, like, whatever, it's like, the answer, yeah, and
Anything
like Laura
after
said,
just.
Yeah.
Exactly.
the
That's
short
what
answer
it
is
does.
is no.
You're right. It's okay in these little moments or
Right.
these little where you're working on those individual pieces, but the big answer is no.
Right,
You can't
right.
just anything.
You don't want your child to just stay in one place, right? So we want to always be, or at least we're assuming that's what we are wanting here. So we want to always be just, not just. We want to always
Well,
be
we want to be just.
pushing into these. Yes, true. We want to always be just. We want to always be a little bit, at least, in what the educator world calls their zone of proximal development, right in that area of where they can be struggling productively. So you don't want to be overwhelming them, but you don't want to be letting it all be way too easy. In these areas where they're struggle, while still letting them do things in the areas where they're strong, because of course we want to encourage those areas as well.
Right. And that concept that you just hit upon is one we will talk about
Oh, the
in
zone.
future
Yes.
podcasts, right?
It's
We're
very
gonna
Yep.
unpack,
Yep.
we're gonna
So-
unpack our view of that.
So I was just going to say this might be an opportunity to go back upstream a little bit and talk about our entire language system. Because reading and writing are these high level outputs that we get to. So let's back up and talk about developing the language system from,
For
early on.
deep learning.
Right,
Yeah.
which leads us back nicely to conversation, leads us to speaking
Right.
and listening.
That's a big part of developing that language
Right,
system.
right. And we have to develop that system. That is the system that reading and writing is built upon.
Yes, we build reading and writing from your verbal language system that is there. Because if you think about it, a child who's learning to read and write should already be a pretty fluent language user verbally, right? We're typically not teaching someone to read and write who hasn't yet learned to talk. So we are building new skills on hopefully a very strong verbal system that is there because it is very, very related. So we want to do as much as we can to have a strong verbal system to then build upon with reading
It's
and
kind
writing.
of, to go way back, is the context of relation, right? Where
Right.
you, at the very beginning, that things become more understandable, deeper, the
More
more
contextual.
the more contextualized they are. So the more connected you are. So building your reading writing system on top of that contextualized speaking listening system,
Yeah.
like of course you're going to have better outcome from already having that connection.
Well, because
Right,
it's
and-
something that they have in place.
Right, they know.
Yeah.
Right, and those of us who've had, toddlers who are learning to talk know that game where they walk around the room and they pick stuff up and they they either like babble at it and then we give a name, right? Or they may name it and we say, yeah, that's your baby
You
doll.
expand upon
right?
the little thing
We're
that they
having
say.
this, game of, just saying, now say baby doll. Now say doggy, right? With no doggy and baby doll in place would be absurd to us.
And then we slowly build off, doggy to doggy wants out. And you kind of build kids into these longer and longer phrases. And it turns out, actually, new research indicates that a lot of that language acquisition is based on rhythm.
Yeah.
Kids pick up on the rhythm of how you speak.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things parents do is they also, when a child says something like doggy, a parent, rather than just repeat what the child said, tends to take what the child said that was small and expand it into a bigger context, right? So a child says juice and parent says, oh, you want more juice? Yeah, orange juice is your favorite. Here's your juice. And they've taken that one word and created much more language around it. And then as the child gains more, you begin to do this back and forth, which is the engagement in the verbal system that really is creating that producing.
Yeah, which is exactly what, to jump back ahead again, we do with writing practice, which is kind of fun. That like you start with, depending on where they are in this level, they have one word and you expand upon it writing, and then they're growing in what they have, and you're back and forth, turn taking.
And you're turn taking with infants even before they are making noises. They widen their eyes, you widen your eyes, you smile, they smile.
Parents set up conversational habits with little babies, and there's been a lot of research around that, where babies are, blow a raspberry, and the parent responds like that was a conversational turn, and then the baby, does something else, seemingly whatever, right? And the parent responds as if it was a conversational turn, and babies actually, as young as like 4 and 6 months, pick up on that back and forth.
Right. And what we know now is that kind of conversation builds synaptic responses. And that plays into also when we are really talking about ideas. When we're really engaging in this turn-taking discussion, we are fostering deep learning.
Right.
That's
and we're at risk as a society with all of the mechanical and electronic devices that we all carry around to shut down conversation in our daily lives. And we all have to be careful of that we're still engaging back and forth all the time, talking about what we talk about and thinking about what we think about, and on and on.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's become a new factor in these last 15 years or so for children, and kind of the kinds of interactions or the kind of engagement they are actually having. Is it more passive day to day as they're developing language now that there's so much technology around them than it would have been without? So that is something always to be thinking about as parents raising kids in this day and age.
Well, and I think it's no different than the television debate we had when we were
when we were
the generation of
now
television.
it's just much more mobile.
Now it's more mobile, and it's in everybody's hand. It's not
in your
sitting,
pocket instead of having to go into a room and turn it on. Now you just pull it out of your pocket.
And there's a lot of them. There's just more ways to get into what might be a passive mode. Now, does this mean that, this morning my son was showing me the trailer to Mary Poppins, which, by the way, looks awesome. But anyway, and the two of us are standing there watching this trailer and commenting, and, I'm not saying, there's no place for any of this, of course. We're back to the word just.
Yes. Nothing happens in a vacuum.
So another idea about conversation that I think Maura touched on when she was talking about young children is it really, and Tracy was referencing this also, that it really helps kids attach knowledge and cement ideas. And again, it's output.
It is output. We don't think of it that way. But, and it's also always contextual. If you're in conversation with somebody, it's automatically in context.
Yeah, and you immediately know when it's not, because you're completely confused.
And that's happened.
You're like, I don't know who you are, I don't know what you're talking about, and I'm done here.
No context here.
Sometimes the context there, and I'm still confused. So we have these conversational writing strategies that are part of our supported writing and editing class, and that's what we delve into there, because we know now we have to make sure that we're supporting the foundation as we also build on that foundation. You know, you don't wait till the foundation is all the way up. It's not like a building. Like, you don't want to start, you know, floor 3 when the foundation isn't in on a building. We can't really afford that, and that's not really the way the brain works. The brain's working much more through connection.
Well,
so I can be building this skill here and still having, you know, be 5 stories up.
On this
I
other
was
skill,
actually going
right.
to say, it is, I feel like the building metaphor is a good one, but it's not a simplified building metaphor. Because the simplified building metaphor is you put the foundation in and you build it up.
It's too linear. It's this, then this, then this,
But
then
like
this.
the way buildings are actually built is there's windows being manufactured here and doors being manufactured here and
Nice.
drywall over
Oh,
here
that's a
and
great
scaffolding
point.
here. So it's like, yes, the foundation has to go in first for the building to be upright.
But there's a lot
But
happening.
there's a lot happening
But
at
in
once.
our
yeah.
basement floor, and when we built our house, got poured after the whole rest of the house was built on the wall.
So maybe it's like Tracy's house.
Yeah, because it was too cold outside to pour the floor when it was time.
So
months
think
later.
of your language metaphor as Tracy's house.
Right. Well, the whole thing is, don't say, I'm not going to work on writing till I feel like they're reading.
Right.
I'm not going to work on free writing until copy work is better.
Well,
like, that's not
right.
what we're saying.
You
And
gotta
for
build
a-
windows and doors and drywall
Yes,
and all
For
this
a
stuff at
struggling
once.
learner too, I have this kind of 80% philosophy where you might have a kid who you're working on short vowel sounds, and 2 years down the road they still don't always get the short vowel sound, right? That's something that is like majorly hard for them. Now, would I never move on to teaching them other spellings because they
One
never
lesson.
got 100% on their short vowel sounds? I cannot do that. So I try to get to kind of an 80%-ish. That's obviously like a ballpark, you know, that's not the same for every child before I start moving on and pulling in other things. And pulling in other things can actually help them make connections that then strengthen something that they struggled with.
It doesn't mean you don't go back.
No, and then
constantly
you're
revisit.
constantly
Yeah.
recycling. Right.
Well, I mean, I like this building thing. I'm going to come back to this building metaphor.
Oh, Claire.
But like the house thing, like your house is not perfect after you finish building it, right? Like,
Right.
well, now I never have to do anything to it. It's great.
And
No,
it
you
doesn't
have to-
not
and
degrade.
it's
Oh,
very-
that is also a great
There
point.
are cracks that appear. You need to refinish the bathroom. You have to repaint. You have to
Getting
update
water
your
in the
furniture.
basement.
Yeah, you have a
They
leak
sit
in
in
your
this
basement.
thing called nature, which seems to constantly be encroaching
Right.
upon the integrity of the house.
Exactly, but it's the same idea that you're constantly exposed to new literature, new experiences, new things. You're
Right.
going out there, you're growing, you're learning, and so there cracks might appear, water might get in the basement, and you have to come back to
Exactly. You might
solidify
feel really
things.
solid in a skill, and then hey, you move up a grade level, and suddenly you're being asked to do something your child was never asked to do before, and now all of a sudden they're kind of crumbling again in that, and so we want to be always building as strongly as we can so that they are able to handle the new thing.
Right.
Well,
we use that example in grammar with subject and verb. You know, we start out having kids find subject and verb, and that's very simple. When the sentence is Jim runs,
Right.
you have a subject, you have a verb.
And you might feel
But-
great about that. Yeah.
But we put some quotes in from Animal Farm where it was darned hard
Oh,
to
man.
find the subject and verb. in
As
that
an adult.
sentence.
Yes,
Yeah.
let alone these higher level grammatical
Yeah,
skills.
forget anything
so,
else.
So
Right,
things you felt solid about suddenly don't feel so solid
Right,
anymore
right.
and need revisited.
Exactly.
So keep remembering that conversation is an important tool.
Right.
That was, a basis that we really showed in Trees in the Forest. We were talking about deep learning and deep reading and comprehension in that book, and we were using these strategies of conversation and bits and pieces of writing. We were looking for output at these different levels. Another thought, just as we think about, hey, just because one skill's here doesn't mean that at the next grade level, when the next process, comes into place, you're not going to go back and have to struggle with that. That's actually what a reading weakness tends to look like.
Yeah.
You can have a very
Or writing.
intact, and writing. You can have a very intact speaking, listening system, but now you've added symbols.
Right.
I have a student who is the perfect example of this. He looks completely verbally speaking and listening. His comprehension, his verbal expression is like up off the charts.
Yeah, super
right?
intelligent. Yeah.
As soon as we add writing, we have this crash.
Right. But this is a really nice play in language. This is why we have a metaphor of a tree with these 4 trunks that when you work on one area, you are feeding that whole tree
Yeah.
too, you know?
And the fact that they can sometimes feel so like, why is he so great here, and then this part of language is
Right.
like the way they come together and feed each other, but can be distinct in a struggle, right?
Yeah.
Is showing that system. It's a great way to kind of see the system
Right.
happening.
Yeah.
Just
Dr. Paula Mellum from the University of Georgia says meaning happens in the middle.
It's like my favorite.
And
I love
it's one of my
that.
favorite things that she said. And that's just something to remember when things are messy and everything's not linear and, oh, you know, we did this one more task and now we had to go back and talk about it. Well, that's where meaning is happening.
Right.
All of that.
And
is
that
where
kind of,
meaning
that
happens.
messy kind of middle area. That also reflects, I feel like that phrase reflects the conversation aspect.
Yes.
That the back and forth, it's not you teaching me. That's not where a lot of meaning, some meaning might happen there. Or you lecturing me.
listening in a
Yeah,
lecture.
I'm just
Yeah,
listening.
exactly.
Not you teaching. Teaching is good. Just lecturing though, I might get some
that
meaning.
just
There's a
word.
just again. I might get some meaning from that, but the most meaning that's going to happen is when you have those exchanges, because it's that middle ground that we're both sharing.
Come together. That's what we want.
So
We all to come together.
when Maura starts singing, that means the podcast is coming to an
Is
end.
that the sign?
So just remember, talking, writing, those are all great exercises and output.
Yeah, remember Rita mentioned it very quickly. Bits and pieces of writing. Writing doesn't have to be some
It doesn't have to
huge,
be a paper.
expensive
Yeah.
ordeal every time.
Right. All those things help grow the brain. We're finding out
Right.
literally. I mean, scientists now can look at, you know, the electrical impulses of how fast things are connecting, how that changes. And it also helps us consolidate skills and build concepts. And above all, it leads to deep learning.
Woohoo!
Yay!
All right, guys, thank you for listening to the Rooted in podcast. We would love it on whatever platform you're listening on. Give us a like, leave us a comment. Visit our website, rootedinlanguage.com. You've been a fabulous audience.